Yesterday, we had a blockbuster show. We had a major national scoop. The dictatorship of Saudi Arabia has hired one of the world's largest law firms to send threatening letters to Canadian TV stations warning them not to run an ad calling attention to the abuse of women in Saudi Arabia. You can see that ad in the background now. Even worse, Canadian TV stations are actually obeying that Saudi fatwa. CTV, Canada's largest private broadcaster, and at least one other TV station have told the Saudis they're going to obey them. To hell with their contracts. The only way I found out about this is that I'm a volunteer with the human rights NGO that produced the ads, and I was shocked to receive a tip from a broadcaster who had been threatened. The ad is totally factual, of course. It talks about how Saudis treat women. The ad was even footnoted, for crying out loud. But the Saudis hired the biggest, baddest law firm they could, called Norton Rose, with 2,600 lawyers to threaten TV stations not to run it. EthicalOil.org, the NGO that produced the ad, actually had a written contract with CTV to air the ad this week. But then CTV sent this email saying they've been threatened. Given the fact that we, BCE, are in receipt of notice as to legal dispute between the parties, prudent thing to do is to hold off on airing. Our position should be that we are in receipt of notice of a legal dispute with respect to this spot, and that accordingly we will not broadcast the spot until the legal dispute is resolved, unquote. But of course there is no litigation, there's no lawsuit. Even Norton Rose isn't creative enough to come up with a legitimate legal complaint about the ad. They haven't sued anyone, they've just done a lot of threatening that they will or they might. That's enough to scare off TV stations who don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars defending a nuisance suit against a foreign dictator. I invited Rahul Agarwal on the show again today. He's the Saudis lawyer who made the threats. Just like yesterday, he didn't accept my invitation. Neither did the Saudi ambassador. I mean, bullies are usually cowardly. We know Saudi Arabia is an awful place. We know they're bullies. We know they support and finance terrorism around the world. I mean, really, who would expect any better from the Saudis? Certainly not me. I guess we've been lucky that they've only been making legal threats. When the Saudis are mad, sometimes far worse things can happen. But it's been 24 hours since we blew the lid off the story yesterday, and as Ali Khan Velshi, the community organizer behind Ethical Oil, told us on the show yesterday, he sent a letter of concern to the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament. And nothing. Not a word from John Baird, the Foreign Minister. Now, Dean Allison, the Conservative chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, wrote back to Ali Khan saying, and I'll read it in full, "Dear Mr. Velshi, thank you for your email and for your bringing your concerns to my attention. I will bring your correspondence to the attention of ministers responsible and the committee members once we reconvened, and they, as a committee, will make the decision, blah, 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 blah. Sincerely, Dean Allison, blah, blah, blah." I mean, seriously, that's called a PFO letter in the business. Thanks for your note. We'll look at it later and maybe get back to you if we have something to say. Sorry, gotta go. Even worse was a response from Joe Oliver's press flack, Julie DiMambro. Joe Oliver is the Natural Resources Minister, and here's what Julie DiMambro said. "Our government is committed to the environmentally friendly and socially responsible development of our oil sands resources." Seriously, like the Saudis are threatening TV stations with lawsuits. TV stations are capitulating. And the minister in charge of the oil sands doesn't have anything to say, certainly not by himself. He sends out a junior staffer who talks about how green the oil sands are. That is not the point. I like the oil sands. Some Canadians don't. That is not the point. The point is that the Saudi dictators are bullying TV stations into silence and blackballing a human rights ad about Saudi women, stopping it from being aired. What the hell does that have to do with what some junior staffer named Julie DiMambro said? Cuckoo. But if you think the government of Canada was lame, they are positively champions when compared to the mainstream media itself. I mean, where were our friends at PEN Canada, the free speech group? They've come on our show before to talk about censorship of the radio song Money for Nothing by Dire Straits. I was sure they'd come on today to talk about a foreign dictatorship bringing Sharia censorship to Canada. Nope, they simply refuse to talk about it. Too tough, I guess. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, same thing, silence. Smash up a store in a G20 protest and they'll talk about your rights till the cows come home. Saudi Arabia censoring CTV, and the civil liberties left-wingers say, boring. How about journalistic groups, like groups of reporters, like the Parliamentary Press Gallery, or a group called Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression? Nothing. Not a word. When Stephen Harper limits them to 3 questions in a scrum, they write 100 self-serving stories about censorship. When the government doesn't give some arts grant to some punk musician, the media writes about censorship. That's not censorship. But when censorship actually happens, when Saudi Arabia threatens broadcasters in Canada with massive nuisance suits for airing a human rights ad, nothing, nothing, nothing. Amnesty International, how about them? Nothing. They're too busy condemning Israel to give a damn about Saudi Arabia. We invited Amnesty on the show today. Nothing. The Canadian Bar Association, they put out more than 200 press releases for Omar Khadr, a convicted terrorist, claiming that his charter rights were breached. He's a convicted terrorist. But not a word about a terrorist-sponsoring country like Saudi Arabia, when our charter rights truly are being flattened. Not a word. Well, how about our rival media? How about CTV? That's a joke. I mean, do you think that CTV would do a news story about how CTV caved in on censorship? Okay, fine. How about CBC, the state broadcaster? Of course not. Look, they're anti-oil sands to begin with and pro-Saudi Arabia, so they really couldn't be bothered. Well, how about all of the media critics out there who have crapped on the Sun News Network over the past 6 months, who have derided us as not serious enough, not thoughtful enough, not journalistic enough? Well, they're all hiding under their desks. This is the test of journalistic freedom, of journalistic integrity, of journalistic ideals. A foreign dictatorship has hired a law firm to threaten Canadian TV stations into blacklisting a human rights ad. TV stations are complying with this fatwa out of fear, and the press gallery is scared or ignorant, or you know what? They probably support the ban in some cases. All of our journalistic superiors, all of the journalism school professors, all of the experts, they are all goddamn cowards. Just like they were during the Danish cartoon riots. They were all too scared to show some banal cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Scared of riots? But mainly scared of being called politically incorrect, scared of the hassle. We are not saints at the Sun for simply reporting this. That's our job. The Sun isn't amazing and awesome because they're the only TV station in Canada to air those ethical oil ads. That's what TV stations actually do for a living. They sell ads and take money. That's the job. But what about the Prime Minister? Where the hell is he? Today, his office put out some talking points to Tory supporters. Here's what it said. Quote, "We are proud that the press and third-party organizations are free to speak their minds in reporting and advertising in our country," unquote. But that's not true, is it? That's not true. That's actually the problem here. TV stations are not free to speak their minds. Advertisers are not free to speak their minds because Saudi Arabia is paying a 2,600-man law firm to make threats, and CTV and other broadcasters are obeying those threats. That is the problem. We are not free here, actually. Even the NDP, no fans of the oil sands, they get it. Here's what Paul Dewar, the NDP's foreign affairs critic, had to say yesterday. He said, quote, "I think the Saudis should probably stick to regulating their own affairs. It's not for them to decide what's on our airwaves." Exactly. And he's the foreign affairs critic. The foreign affairs minister, and his sexy parliamentary secretary in Canada have been silent on this. The Saudis are being bastards, but look, that's who they are. We expect no better from them. But we expect better from our own fellow journalists who are silent. We expect better from the foreign minister who's silent. We expect better from the Prime Minister's office that's pretending there's no problem here. But thank God for Jason Kenney. He's not the foreign minister or the natural resources minister, but he knows about human rights and he speaks up against charlatans like Amnesty International. This is not his file, but he was asked about this by Alex Mihailovich of The Sun today, and he let her rip. Look at this video.
Canada is a country that is a champion of freedom of speech. That is a constitutional right, and we don't take kindly to foreign governments threatening directly or indirectly Canadian broadcasters or media for giving voice to freedom of speech. We think that's inappropriate and certainly inconsistent with Canada's belief in freedom of speech.
Jason Kenney, in response to The Sun, called out the Saudis. You know what? On my way into the studio, I'm going to take a break from my planned presentation. On my way into the studio, I got an email from another brave cabinet minister, and I'm going to read it from my BlackBerry. I'm sorry I haven't had time to put it in the computer for you to see on the screen. This is from Rona Ambrose, the Minister for the Status of Women. I'm just going to read it to you because it's so awesome, and then I'll get back to my presentation. As Minister for Status of Women, I support those who shed light on the abuse of women's basic rights and freedoms around the world. And then she goes for the close. We in Canada should never take these freedoms for granted and should always remember those women in other countries, such as Saudi Arabia, who continue to be denied the most basic of rights, the right to vote or even being allowed to drive. I applaud the efforts of any Canadian individual or organization, such as ethicaloil.org, working to raise awareness about women's oppression in any corner of the world. We will only achieve equality for women if we face those challenges head on, no matter who we offend. Signed, the Honorable Rona Ambrose. I just got that right now. You know what? Rona Ambrose is awesome. Jason Kenney is awesome. But I'm sorry that our Prime Minister and our Foreign Affairs Minister are AWOL. I want you to go to your computer and I want you to write an email to the Prime Minister right now. pm@pm.gc.ca. You tell the Prime Minister that it's his job to get tough with the Saudis. It's not the Minister for Women. It's not the Minister for Immigration. It's the Prime Minister's job. It's the Foreign Minister's job. The CTV ban on this human rights ad continues today. The bullies at the Saudi law firm are continuing their threats today. Nothing has changed other than now we know that when the chips are down, you can count the true friends of freedom in this government on one hand. Hell, on two fingers. Welcome back to the show. I have identified a breach between the official talking points of the Prime Minister's office and the Natural Resources Office and Ron Ambrose and Jason Kenney, who are speaking from the heart. Well, now we're going to go to a man who has been at the center of this Conservative government for 10 years. He's no longer subject to cabinet and caucus solidarity. I'm talking about my old friend, Stockwell Dave, former Minister of many important things in the government, who joins us now via Skype from the Rockies of Alberta. Hey, Stock, thanks for being on the show.
Good to be with you.
Now, I mean, you're a man who speaks passionately about things you care about, and I know you're a big fan of freedom, and I'll say it, I'm a big fan of yours. You've been following this Saudi effort to bully media. CTV has canceled the contract with ethicaloil.org. I would like you to speak. What do you think this government should be doing that maybe they're not doing so far?
Well, first, this is somewhat unheard of in my experience, Ezra. We've had disputes with countries before. That can happen anytime. We've had disputes with the United States, Great Britain, Russia. I can't recall right now of any time where a government, a foreign government, has tried to intervene with Canadian organizations, especially a nonprofit organization here, threatening them to basically be quiet when they're just out there stating some facts. So this is unheard of. I do think the Saudi government is going to regret this. I think the public reaction, regardless of where Canadians are on the issue of ethical oil itself, once they see an attempt by a foreign government to come in and actually smack down media agencies and tell them what they can or cannot show to Canadians, I do think the Saudis will probably regret this tactic, and they should regret it. When you hear someone like Minister Ambrose, who has been a consistent defender of women's rights, being quite rightly upset about this, most Canadians are, and this is really going too far by the Saudi government.
Stock, I think you're right that Ron Ambrose was speaking passionately and to me very persuasively, but it's also equally clear to me, Stock, that her message that she emailed to me was clearly not vetted by the diplomats at our Foreign Affairs Department. I think that there is a certain mass in the federal government that doesn't want to rock the boat. Even the Prime Minister's official talking points that were circulated today didn't have an unkind words to say about the Saudis. Now, you've worked in international affairs before. You were the Minister for Foreign Trade. You've had to deal with some countries that frankly aren't our best friends. How cautious does Prime Minister Harper really have to be in the face of this abuse by the Saudis? I mean, shouldn't he be able to at least give them a verbal wrapping, if nothing more?
I think in fairness, Ezra, I mean, Prime Minister, as you probably saw, was just on the news, involved with a news conference related to the Libya situation where Canadian troops have stepped up and we have taken out or pushed out of action an awful dictator. And that's in that same neighborhood. So, you know, the number of things that hit the Prime Minister's desk on a given morning or afternoon, especially while he's dealing with taking a lead position in NATO on standing up against terrorist activity. I think we should acknowledge that. And the Prime Minister's office will always assess. You know, they've just got these reports in, and they'll make an assessment in terms of how they're going to respond. I can assure you, from what I know, there's been no restriction either on Jason Kenney, Ronna Ambrose, or anybody else in terms of making the statements that they made today. This is a very serious, I would call it, at the very least, a breach of protocol for a foreign government to step into Canada and try and slap down the issue, especially related to the nonprofit group Ethical Oil. I think it's a fair question to ask other countries and other buyers. Do you want to buy from a country that is that continues to have some very significant...
Stock, we're losing the connection with you. Hopefully you can come back. Hopefully we can fix that connection right now. I will acknowledge the point you make that the Prime Minister, it's an exceedingly busy day for him. And actually, Joe Oliver, the Natural Resources Minister, flew down to New York with the Prime Minister today as well. So I acknowledge that just because I'm all worked up about this doesn't mean it's at the top of his to-do list. I accept that. But, you know, this has been going on for a number of days, and frankly, these threats have been being made in Canada for a number of weeks. I think we've lost our connection with Stockwell Day. He was joining us via Skype from the Rockies. Can you hear me again, Stock? I'm afraid we've lost Stockwell Day, but he did make some good points, and I do accept that the Prime Minister may have more important things on his to-do list today. I am pleased with Jason Kenney and Ronna Ambrose, but I think the silence of the Foreign Affairs Department and the vacuousness of the talking points from the Prime Minister's office today, I think that's something that have to... Oh, I'm just hearing that we've got Stockwell Day back on. Stock, are you there?
I am here. I do not think I was interfered with by the Saudis on our lost communication, but I can tell you... I don't know if it was transmitted when I said it. I can tell you there would be no restriction on Ronna Ambrose, on Jason Kenney, and making the comments that they made. This is a very significant action by a foreign government to attempt to silence an organization that's stating some things that are true, that women do not have a full array or any close to the array of equal rights that quite rightly they have, certainly in Canada and most of the free world. It was just earlier in the news this week, a man in Saudi Arabia was beheaded because he was practicing sorcery. Look, I don't practice sorcery, but everybody should have the freedom to practice whatever religious beliefs they want. And so the questions are simply being asked of people. Yeah. Do you agree with these types of things being practiced in other governments? And to see a foreign government react this way, as I said, I think they will regret it because they will really stir a pot of activity on this. And I think, ironically, what may happen here, Ezra, is more people will start to look at the question, which is being tagged ethical oil and gas coming from Canada, which is one of probably the leading nation in terms of human rights and supporting democracy in the world today. We saw that with the Prime Minister out today talking about what we've accomplished in Libya. Would people prefer to have their energy from countries like that, countries like Canada, which do have environmental standards, which are very much concerned on the environmental side? Or would you prefer to buy from other countries which don't support that same array of rights and protections? So those are fair questions to be asked, and it's a good debate. And you know what? People should still be able to do business with Saudi Arabia. You know that I'm not protectionist when it comes to trade. I've been to Saudi Arabia a number of times. I believe in promoting Canadian products and services everywhere. I think we have some good trade there. But I do not think that people should be stifled and threatened in terms of talking about the differences in the array of rights that people have or don't have. And I do think the Saudis have overstepped. I think they will probably regret what they've stirred up here today just because of public reaction in Canada. I don't think it's going to be favorable, regardless of where people are on the actual issue of so-called ethical will.
Stock Dave, former minister in various portfolios, thank you very much for joining us and jamming us in your schedule. Glad you were able to join us by Skype. Take care, my friend. After the break, our free speech watchdog and diversity consultant, Kathy Shaidle, on the media's silence in this scandal. That's next on The Source. What do you think of that fancy new graphic for freedom of speech? I love it. Unfortunately, we have to talk about freedom of speech almost every day because it's under attack all the time. Kathy Shaidle, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
You're our diversity consultant, our free speech consultant. How do you like the diversity of the Saudi culture when it comes to freedom of speech?
Oh, it's pretty sad, isn't it? It's pretty sad. And then you have the diversity of the leftists in the world who aren't raising a hand to voice their opposition to the Saudi censors.
Not just that, but the ad was about feminism.
Exactly.
And just the most basic feminism, like, can women go out, can women ever feel the breeze of the wind on their face? Can women ever feel the sun on their face? No, because you got to wear a burqa. Can women drive? Can women vote? Like, I'm not talking about super fancy pants feminism. I'm talking about basic rights.
Yep, that's right.
And Judy Rebick, answer your phone. Where the hell are the official feminists?
Well, that's what I want to know, because yesterday you brought up Death of a Princess, which is the 20-year-old BBC documentary and about a Saudi princess who was killed because she had an affair. And I remember being a leftist in those days, there was outrage everywhere. This movie was the biggest deal ever. Oh, we have to help the poor women in Saudi Arabia. In those days, Tom Hanks' wife used to put on these $1 million fundraisers for Afghan women. Now, I don't know when the memo went out, September 11th, whatever. Suddenly that's all dropped off. They've got new causes now. I've never had a good explanation, but they now seem to be, for some reason, on the side of the Saudis, which is the last place I would have thought the left would have ended up if you'd asked me 20 years ago.
Yeah. You know what? There's a clip I want to show you. Here's Stephen Harper the other day saying what he thinks the #1 threat to Canada is. Let's roll this clip.
There are a number of threats on different levels, but if you look at, if we're talking about terrorism, I mean, the major threat is still Islamicism. There are other threats out there, but that is the one that I can tell you occupies the security apparatus most regularly in terms of actual terrorist threats.
Now he's talking about terrorist threats, and I'm not talking about terrorist threats, I'm talking about illegal jihad, lawfare. What surprised me, I mean, you heard my monologue, Jason Kenney, the greatest champion of liberty in this government, let's give him tremendous credit, and what he said was clearly not run by the diplomats first. Ron Ambrose sent me a note, clearly not approved by the PMO. Why is the Prime Minister's office so damn scared about calling out Islamicism when it's being affected through lawyers instead of through terrorists?
Well, that's another one. That's another bizarre question. I understand why PM Harper personally is engaged in being upset about Islamic terrorism, because he was the guy who was going to be beheaded in that plan. But maybe he needs to look a little bit more at what you've talked about, which is the lawfare. Why fly planes into buildings anymore when all you have to do is sue people and get your way? It happened in England. There was the Saudis sued over a book that, again, was completely factual. But under British libel law, the judge still said, yes, this book is libelous, and every copy has been destroyed that ever existed. Now, that's crazy.
Now, Stockwell Day made the point that, look, Stephen Harper's a little bit busy today. He's a little bit busy all the time. I'm not the only person in the world that wants a piece of his attention.
Right.
Fine, fine, fine. But he has staffers, he has deputies, he has delegates. He is a foreign affairs minister. That foreign affairs minister, when he's too busy, well, he has a parliamentary secretary when he's not busy surfing BeijingBrides.com or something. Maybe he can help us out. The official memo was just silence. Last question. Where the hell are the better journalists? I'm not an official journalist. I'm not a good journalist. I didn't go to journalism school. I'm not one of the fancy guys at the Globe and Mail, at the CBC, at the Toronto Star. Why have those three news organizations not said a bloody word about CTV being hit with a fatwa and worse, complying with that.
Oh, exactly. I don't know. The Saudis make for weird bedfellows anyway. But it just seems to me that this is all about the left. Again, if you ask a journalist in Canada, they'll tell you, I'm not a leftist, I'm a centrist, or I'm an independent. And all that really means is that they've never really met anyone who disagrees with them, so they must be centrist. Yeah. But they are also following that bizarre, mysterious party line of don't offend the Saudis, don't offend Muslims, and it's patronizing, it's wrong-headed, and they're letting their own side down. They are supposed to be journalists too. Yeah. I don't get it.
This reminds me of that cartoon thing. On that day I learned that 99% of people who talk about journalistic ethics are full of it.
Yep.
Kathy Shaidle, thanks for being here. Hey.